We are culturally conditioned to interpret the elves of Middle-earth through a lens of absolute, blinding purity. When the average audience member observes Galadriel, the Lady of the Wood, they see a flawless, saintly figure. They see a radiant, angelic being who dispenses ancient wisdom, floats above the petty, corrupt realities of the mortal world, and acts as a static, incorruptible monument to absolute goodness. We are meant to look at her and feel the comforting presence of a benevolent, maternal deity. But if we strip away the ethereal, glowing lights, the soft, cinematic focus, and the romanticized, mythological framing, we are left with a profoundly different, terrifyingly clinical profile. Galadriel was not born a saint. She was not a passive, benevolent observer of history. If we examine the deep lore of the First Age through the uncompromising lens of psychological analysis, we are looking at a highly ambitious, politically radicalized exile. We are analyzing a personality defined by staggering narcissism, a pathological need for absolute control, and a superiority complex so deeply ingrained that it lasted for thousands of years. Today, we are deconstructing the psychology of the Lady of Lothlórien. We are going to analyze her existence not as a comforting fairy tale, but as a grueling, millennia-long case study in the burden of immense pride, the pathology of micromanagement, and the terrifying, ultimately liberating reality of ego death. To understand the absolute psychological collapse and subsequent resolution of Galadriel's character at the end of the Third Age, we must first aggressively dissect her original trauma and her fundamental psychological driver. That driver was pure, unadulterated ambition. During the First Age, in the divine realm of Valinor, the closest equivalent to an absolute paradise in Tolkien's universe, Galadriel was a member of the Noldor royalty. When Feanor initiated his catastrophic, bloody rebellion against the gods to reclaim the stolen Silmarils, Galadriel joined the Great Exodus. She crossed the grinding ice to reach Middle-earth, but her motives were chillingly distinct from those of her kin. The historical texts compiled in the Legendarium make it explicitly, uncomfortably clear. She did not leave paradise out of a sense of moral duty. She did not leave because she wanted to fight the Dark Lord Morgoth and liberate the oppressed. She left because she wanted to rule. She harbored a burning, insatiable desire to govern a realm of her own. In Valinor, she was surrounded by the Valar literal breathing gods. In that divine hierarchy, no matter how brilliant, how beautiful, or how powerful she became, she would always remain a subordinate. She would never possess absolute, unquestioned authority. Middle-earth, however, was a wild, untamed, and sprawling continent. To her deeply arrogant, visionary mind, it was a blank geopolitical canvas waiting for a master architect. She marched into exile because she wanted subjects. She wanted to be the sole architect of her own reality, accountable to no higher power. For centuries, she operated under the immense, crushing weight of this pride. The Noldor rebellion was ultimately doomed, ending in catastrophic bloodshed and the sinking of an entire subcontinent. Even when the Valar eventually offered a full pardon to the exiled elves after the defeat of Morgoth, Galadriel explicitly refused to return. Her pride had become a terminal condition. To return to the West meant admitting geopolitical and personal defeat. It meant acknowledging that her grand experiment in absolute sovereignty was a failure, and that she was not, in fact, a god capable of shaping the world to her will. She chose to remain in a decaying, dangerous world, rather than swallow her ego and ask for forgiveness. By the time we reached the Third Age, this burning ambition had mutated into something far more defensive, but equally pathological. It transitioned from a desire for aggressive expansion to a desperate, obsessive compulsion for preservation. This brings us to the clinical reality of Lothlórien and the exact function of Nenya, the Ring of Water. We are taught to view Lothlórien as a beautiful, natural sanctuary, a perfect harmony of nature and elven grace. In truth, from a sociological and psychological standpoint, it was a quarantine zone. It was a closed ward terrarium managed by a severe, uncompromising control freak. Nature, by its very definition, is governed by entropy. Things grow, they mutate, they decay, they die, and they are replaced. That is the biological law of the mortal world. Galadriel, terrified of the shifting geopolitics of Middle-earth, the rise of Sauron, and the inevitable mathematical fading of the elven race, used her ring of power to artificially halt the passage of time. She did not heal the forest of Lothlórien, she froze it. She placed an entire ecosystem into a state of unnatural, cryogenic stasis. This is the ultimate, apex manifestation of micromanagement. Galadriel realized she could no longer control the external world. She could not control the rise of Mordor. She could not control the failing, corruptible lines of men or the stubborn greed of the dwarves. The macro environment of Middle-earth was a chaotic, unpredictable variable she could no longer dominate. So she built a golden cage. She created an isolated, heavily fortified bubble where she had absolute, tyrannical control over the very fabric of time itself. She forced the environment to conform entirely to her own nostalgic, unyielding will. Lothlórien was not a monument to nature. It was a physical monument to her own staggering ego. It was the geographic manifestation of her refusal to accept that she was no longer the main character in the history of the world. She sat in the center of a dying continent, holding her hands over the ears of her kingdom, refusing to let the clock tick forward. If you find this uncompromising, clinical deconstruction shifting your perspective on the stories you thought you knew, take a brief moment to subscribe to Mythology Deconstructed. We look past the magic and the myth to expose the raw psychological architecture beneath. This pathological need for control sets the stage for the absolute climax of her psychological arc, the arrival of the Fellowship of the Ring, and the infamous moment at the mirror. When Frodo Baggins stands before Galadriel in the dead of night and freely, willingly offers her the One Ring, we are not witnessing a standard heroic fantasy trope of a magical test. We are witnessing a brutal, highly volatile, and deeply dangerous psychological intervention. To understand the sheer terror of this scene, you must remember exactly who Galadriel is beneath the silver gowns. She is a sovereign who willingly left heaven because she wanted absolute power. She is a control addict who has spent thousands of years artificially managing every single molecule of her territory, terrified of change. And now, a desperate, exhausted, and naive mortal is handing her the ultimate administrative override code to the entire world. The ring does not just offer her a weapon to defeat Sauron. It offers her the immediate, tangible realization of the megalomaniacal fantasy she has harbored since she was a youth in the Undying Lands. The ring bypasses her rational mind and whispers directly to her deepest psychopathology. You can finally fix it all. You do not have to hide in this shrinking, pathetic forest anymore. You have the power to impose your flawless, orderly, perfect will upon the entire continent. You can replace the Dark Lord with a Queen of Light, and every living creature will obey your magnificent, unyielding design. When she physically transforms during this scene, when she grows impossibly tall, terrifying, and dark, her voice echoing like thunder, it is not an illusion. It is not a cheap magic trick meant to scare Frodo to test his resolve. That is her mask slipping. That is her true, unfiltered, deeply repressed ego bleeding out into the physical world. For one terrifying, breathless minute, we see the absolute dictator she has always possessed the potential to become. We see the terrifying apex of her pride, unchained from consequence. We see the tyrant who left Valinor. And then, the universe holds its breath, and she stops. She lowers her hand. The terrifying, overwhelming aura recedes. The thunder dies away. She shrinks back down to her normal stature, looks at Frodo, visibly exhausted, and delivers one of the most profoundly tragic, clinical, and beautiful lines of acceptance in modern fiction. I pass the test. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. This is not a victorious battle cry. It is the exact opposite. It is a complete, total, systemic surrender. In clinical psychology, there is a concept known as radical acceptance. It is the agonizing point at which an individual finally stops fighting a reality they cannot change, regardless of how deeply painful or devastating that reality is. By refusing the One Ring, Galadriel is executing a conscious, deliberate ego death. She is finally, after millennia of bitter resistance, acknowledging that her grand experiment is over. She accepts the cold, hard logic of the situation. If the One Ring is destroyed, the 3 elven rings will lose their power. The golden cage of Lothlórien will collapse. Time will flood back into the forest like a breaking dam. The immortal leaves will turn brown. The magic will evaporate, and everything she has painstakingly, obsessively preserved will turn to ash and memory. To refuse the ring is to willingly sign the death warrant of her own kingdom. In that single moment, she relinquishes the pathological need to be a god. She drops the crushing, impossible burden of trying to engineer the perfect world. By stating, "I will remain Galadriel," she is entirely stripping herself herself of her titles, her ambitions, and her artificial sovereignty. She accepts that she is merely a temporary participant in the world, not its eternal master. She accepts entropy. She accepts death in the cultural sense, so that the rest of the world might live. The tragedy and the ultimate triumph of Galadriel is a brutal, uncompromising lesson in the suffocating weight of perfectionism and pride. We are often taught by myth and media that redemption is achieved by performing massive, heroic deeds. We are told that to be forgiven, we must prove our ultimate strength, defeat the monster, and conquer the darkness. But Galadriel's psychological arc proves the clinical reverse. She did not earn her right to finally return to Valinor by wielding unimaginable power to crush Sauron. She did not win her salvation through conquest. She earned her forgiveness by demonstrating the profound, agonizing, and almost impossible strength required to do absolutely nothing. Pride is the heaviest psychological burden an individual can carry because it demands constant, exhausting, unblinking vigilance. It requires you to constantly defend a fragile, artificial construct of your own superiority against a universe that is constantly trying to tear it down. Galadriel carried that agonizing weight on her shoulders for 3 entire ages of the world. Her true victory was not a display of blinding elven magic. It was the quiet, devastating, and intensely private moment when the most powerful being in Middle-earth realized that the only way to save her soul was to let her empire fall. She achieved ultimate clarity not by taking control, but by finally, painfully, allowing the universe to run its course without her permission.